My name is Elena Brandt, and I am 32 years old, and I want to tell you about my marriage to Wesley Hartman and the 11 months it lasted, and the specific moment I understood with complete documented clarity that he had married me based on a fact about my finances that was not true and had never bothered to verify. I need to start with how Wesley and I came to be in each other's orbit because the family relationship matters for understanding how the whole situation developed without me suspecting anything for as long as I did. Wesley was my second cousin by marriage through my aunt's side, a connection that placed him at family gatherings periodically without placing him in my close circle. We had known each other casually for years, the kind of family relationship where you are friendly at Thanksgiving and occasional weddings and do not think about each other much in between. We started actually dating 2.5 years ago when we were both at my cousin's wedding and ended up talking for most of the reception in the specific way that produces an unexpected connection. He was charming, he was attentive, he had a steady career in commercial real estate that gave him financial stability and a professional confidence that I found appealing. We dated for a year before he proposed at my family's lake house on a Saturday in June with most of the extended family present. I said yes. I believed completely that I was saying yes to a man who loved me. What I did not know, and what I would not discover until 8 months into the marriage, was that Wesley had attended my grandfather's funeral 3 years before we started dating, the same funeral most of the extended family had attended, and had overheard a conversation between my aunt and my mother about my grandfather's estate planning. He had heard the words trust fund, and he had heard my name mentioned in proximity to those words, and he had walked away from that partial conversation with a conclusion that he had never bothered to verify and that he carried for the next several years, including throughout our courtship and our engagement and the first 8 months of our marriage. The conclusion was that I was the primary beneficiary of a substantial trust fund my grandfather had established. I was not. I want to be completely clear about the actual structure, because the actual structure is the center of this story. My grandfather had established a trust years before his death that named two of my cousins, Marissa and Daniel, as primary beneficiaries based on a set of family circumstances that predated my birth, and that I had never had reason to fully understand or examine because the trust had simply never been relevant to my life. I was named in the trust document, but as a contingent beneficiary, third in line with distribution rights that would only activate under specific circumstances that had not occurred and were unlikely to occur. Wesley had heard half a conversation at a funeral and had built 18 months of research and an entire marriage on the half he heard. I did not know any of this until month 8 of the marriage, when Wesley's questions about the trust began arriving with a specificity that, in retrospect, should have told me everything considerably sooner than it did. The questions started casually. He would mention the trust in passing, ask whether I had ever talked to the administrator, ask whether I knew the approximate value, ask whether there was a timeline for distribution. I answered honestly each time, which was that I did not think much about the trust because it had never been particularly relevant to me, that I believed Marissa and Daniel were the primary beneficiaries, that I had a contingent position that I understood vaguely but had never examined closely. His reaction to my answers was subtle at first, a slight recalibration in his expression, a follow-up question that suggested he was processing information that did not match what he expected. By month 8, the questions had become frequent enough and specific enough that I started paying closer attention to the pattern rather than to the individual questions. He asked about the administrator's name. He asked whether the trust had a website or a portal I could access. He asked whether contingent beneficiaries had legal standing to request documentation. That last question was the one that made me stop and actually think about what was happening, rather than continuing to answer in the easy, conversational way I had been answering. A husband asking whether his wife has legal standing to request documentation about a trust fund is not a husband asking out of casual curiosity. That is a husband who has a specific interest in the documentation existing and being accessible. I did not confront him immediately. I want to be honest about why. Part of it was disbelief, the specific reluctance to accept that the man I had married might have married me for a reason I had not understood. Part of it was the practical recognition that confronting him without information would produce a conversation I could not win because I did not yet know what I was dealing with. What I did instead was call the trust administrator. His name was Gerald Whitfield, a man who had managed my grandfather's estate planning for over a decade and who had known my grandfather personally before his death. I had met him twice at family meetings I had attended without much engagement because the trust had never felt like something that required my engagement. I called him on a Tuesday afternoon. I explained that I wanted to formally request the documentation I was entitled to as a contingent beneficiary. He said that was a reasonable request and that he could provide it. He asked in the specific, careful way of a professional who has noticed something, whether everything was all right. I said I was not entirely sure yet. He said he understood. He said he would have the documentation to me within the week. The documentation arrived 8 days later. I want to describe what I found in it because the documentation is the center of everything that followed, and I want to be precise about it. The trust structure confirmed what I had vaguely understood. My grandfather had established the trust 15 years before his death, naming Marissa and Daniel as primary beneficiaries with equal shares, based on circumstances related to their parents' financial situation at the time the trust was established that I will not detail here because it belongs to family history that is not mine to fully share. I was named as a contingent beneficiary, third in line, with distribution rights that would activate only if both Marissa and Daniel predeceased the trust's terminal date or were otherwise disqualified, neither of which had occurred or showed any likelihood of occurring. The realistic value of what I might ever receive from the trust was effectively zero under any reasonable scenario. Marissa and Daniel were both alive and well, and the primary beneficiaries, and the contingent structure that named me was, in practical terms, a formality rather than a meaningful financial position. I sat with that documentation for a long time. Then I did something I had not initially planned to do. I called Gerald back and asked a different question. I asked whether anyone had contacted his office in the past 3 years requesting general information about the trust, not as a beneficiary, but as someone researching the family's estate situation. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said that yes, his office had received an inquiry approximately 2.5 years earlier from someone who had identified himself as a family member doing research for estate planning purposes. He said the inquiry had not requested confidential beneficiary information specifically, which his office would not have provided to a non-beneficiary regardless, but had asked general questions about the trust's existence and approximate scope. I asked for the name on that inquiry. He checked his records and told me, Wesley Hartman. 2.5 years earlier, before we had started dating, before the wedding at my cousin's reception where we had reconnected, Wesley had contacted my grandfather's trust administrator's office 2.5 years before our relationship began, researching the trust based on the half conversation he had overheard at the funeral. This was not a man who had developed feelings for me and then become curious about my family's finances. This was a man who had identified a financial target based on incomplete information, researched it before we had any romantic relationship at all, and then engineered a connection with me at my cousin's wedding that he had presumably attended, at least in part, because he knew I would be there. I want to be honest about the period after I received this information, because it was not a clean, immediate confrontation. It was several weeks of me sitting with documentation that reorganized everything I understood about my marriage, while I decided how to approach a conversation that I knew was going to end the marriage, regardless of how I handled it. I consulted an attorney first, not for divorce proceedings yet, but to understand my position. The attorney, a woman named Patricia Soto, who specialized in family law, reviewed the documentation from Gerald and the timeline I had pieced together and confirmed that what I was looking at was significant. Not necessarily fraud in a criminal sense. Marrying someone based on a financial misunderstanding is not illegal, but deeply relevant to the validity and honesty of the marriage and to any divorce proceedings that might follow. She asked whether our prenuptial agreement, which Wesley had insisted on before the wedding, had any clauses related to misrepresentation. I had not looked at it closely since signing it. We pulled it and reviewed it together. The prenup, ironically, had been drafted by Wesley's attorney and was structured in a way that primarily protected his assets, with relatively standard language about mine. There was a clause stating that the agreement could be challenged in the case of material misrepresentation by either party regarding their financial expectations entering the marriage. Wesley had drafted, through his attorney, the exact clause that was going to be used against him. I asked Patricia what she recommended. She said I had a strong position for an annulment or a fast-tracked divorce, with the misrepresentation working in my favor for any settlement negotiations, since Wesley had clearly entered the marriage under a financial premise he had constructed himself and that I had never confirmed or encouraged. I scheduled the conversation with Wesley for a Sunday evening. I had the documentation organized. I had spoken with Patricia about how to present it. I was not interested in a dramatic confrontation. I was interested in clarity. I sat across from him at our kitchen table, and I said I needed to talk to him about the trust fund. He said, okay, with the specific casual tone he had been using for months when the subject came up. I slid the documentation across the table. I watched him read it. I watched his face do the thing faces do when they are processing information that reorganizes everything simultaneously. He read the beneficiary structure. He read the contingent designation. He got to the page with Gerald's notation about the inquiry from 2.5 years ago, with Wesley's name on it. He looked up. He did not say anything for a long moment. I said, "You contacted the trust administrator 2.5 years before we started dating." He did not respond immediately. I said, "Wesley, I need you to explain that to me." He said, "I do not know what you are talking about." I said, "His records have your name and the date and the nature of the inquiry." I said, "Please do not tell me you do not know what I am talking about." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I heard something at your grandfather's funeral." I said, "I know." He said, "I did not understand it fully." I said, "You understood it well enough to call the trust administrator's office and ask about it before you ever asked me out." He did not have a response to that. I said, "Wesley, I need you to be honest with me right now, because everything after this conversation depends on whether you can be." I said, "Did you pursue this relationship because you believed I was going to inherit a significant amount of money?" He looked at the table for a long time. Then he said, "In the beginning, yes." I said, "And later?" He said, "Later, I actually loved you." I said, "I do not know how to evaluate that claim anymore given what I'm looking at." He said, "Elena." I said, "I need you to hear something." I said, "I was never the beneficiary you researched. I was never going to inherit what you thought I was going to inherit." I said, "The entire foundation of whatever this was started on is something that was never true." He put his face in his hands. He said, "I am so sorry." I said, "I believe that you are sorry now." I said, "I do not believe sorry changes the fact that you spent 2.5 years building toward a marriage based on a financial fact you never verified, and that turned out to be false." The marriage ended formally 3 months later. The prenup's misrepresentation clause meant the divorce settlement was structured significantly in my favor, not because I was seeking punishment, but because the documented timeline made clear exactly what had happened, and the law accounted for that. Wesley moved out of state about a year later. I heard through extended family that he had not remarried. I do not know what he understood about himself from what happened, whether he examined the pattern that led him to research a trust fund before he ever asked a woman to dinner, or whether he simply moved forward without the reckoning. I think about Gerald sometimes, the trust administrator who had known my grandfather and who handled my documentation request with the specific, careful professionalism that ended up being the thing that exposed everything. I called him after the divorce was finalized to thank him. He said he had wondered when Wesley's inquiry came through 2.5 years earlier why someone outside the family was asking about the trust's payroll scope. He said he had not been able to do anything about it at the time because there was nothing improper about the inquiry itself. He said he was glad I had eventually asked the right questions. I think about what it means that a marriage can be built entirely on a fact that was never true, and that the person who built it never bothered to verify the foundation before he constructed 18 months of courtship and proposal and a wedding on top of it. I think about how close I came to never finding out if his questions in month 8 had been slightly more careful, slightly less specific. I'm grateful in this specific, complicated way you can be grateful for something that also cost you a marriage, that he was not careful enough. The carelessness that built the marriage on a false foundation was the same carelessness that eventually exposed it. I am remarried now, 2 years later, to someone who has never once asked about my grandfather's trust. I have told him about it because I tell him everything. He has never expressed interest in the details beyond the basic facts of my family history. The difference between that response and Wesley's 18 months of research is the difference I now understand to be the actual measure of whether someone loves you or has calculated you. That's the story. Drop your city in the comments. Hit subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.